Hello, students. We are going to go ahead and give you a bit of a tutorial on federalism in order to make sure we're able to give it a thorough treatment given our time constraints. If you recall, we just got finished talking about the Constitution and how the Founding Fathers had to really look into the various different government types and the arrangements that are possible out there to craft a government that was going to avoid the pitfalls of past governments and sort of combine the virtues of the governments that had come before. In the case of federalism, we're going to be distinguishing between government types and government systems, and Mr. Phillips is going to give us some further insight on that.
Okay, we talked about different types of government in terms of like who runs the country. We talked about they have autocracies, like a monarchy, absolute monarchies, where one ruler, dominates the government. You have, of course, oligarchies, which are, where a few elite leaders run the government. And then, of course, we have different types of democracy. In our case, representative democracy or republic. And obviously that's what the founders were leaning towards that's what they had decided upon when they came to meet to write the Constitution. The question became, how are we going to properly distribute the power between the national and state government? So this slide shows you some of the different options that they had to consider.
In this case, you'll note that with unitary forms of government, the power is largely concentrated in the central government. In fact, under unitary governments, the smaller subunits of governments can actually be gotten rid of, frankly. The central government can, in other words, decide, we no longer want this state. Goodbye, Georgia. But we can see that the opposite is true under a confederation or a confederal arrangement, where the power really rests with the states or the subunits of government. And to some extent, they combine to agree to sort of be ruled by some sort of, or rather, they come together for the purpose of a particular purpose and allow for a weak national government to be there solely to carry out this one purpose or limited set of purposes. We tried that, if you recall. The first document that we have for a government was the Articles of Confederation. And you'll recall that that was rather an abysmal failure for the obvious reasons about the federal government not having enough powers to carry out its basic duties and responsibilities. So to some extent, I would liken this kind of process of trying to settle on one system of government, sort of like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where unitary may be too hot, confederation may be too cold, and federal is like right in between. In this case, the central government and the subunits, they share power. And to be more precise, or rather to give another example here, the states can neither get rid of the federal government, nor can the federal government get rid of any of the states. Under the other two arrangements, one or the other unit could get rid of those units without much consultation. So in this way, they were sort of bound together.
So it kind of has the strengths of unitary without, too much power to the central government. It has a unifying effect, but it also allows for regional differences. So they figured it was kind of a combination of the best of both. The articles hadn't worked, so this was going to bring unity to the country, but at the same time reserve certain important powers for the states. And we talked about that with the Federalist Papers. So here's just a definition of a couple definitions or clarifications on what federalism means. I think the key here is that you have a division of authority or a sharing of government authority and power between the national government and the regional governments, or the political subdivisions, or as we call them, states. And I think you see each has defined powers, and we'll look at that more in a minute with the different powers, how they fall into different categories. Some are exclusively national powers, some are mainly handled at the state level, and then some are handled at both levels or carried out at both levels. So we'd call those shared or concurrent powers, which we talked about earlier.
I think it's also important to remember at this point that Federalism, frankly, sort of outlines what is a relationship between the central government and the state governments. In other words, relationships, just as our relationships evolve, so will the relationship between the central government and the state government. Historical context will necessitate some sort of changes in the way in which these two levels of government will relate and interrelate. And these are just diagrams that sort of give you an idea to sort of help conceptualize these various government systems. And yet some more definitions with respect to federalism. I think it would behoove us to now move toward other content. I think this is something you can review at your own leisure to give yourself some better understanding of this term.
Well, I'd say just, where that last bullet point where I think it's important to understand that both levels hold important degrees of power and authority, and neither one dominates, but we'll see, as Mr. Davos said, we're going to see over time how there is sort of an evolving relationship between the national and state governments through our history as we continue that ongoing struggle. And I think the framers of the Constitution envisioned that there would be a struggle between the national and state governments for power, which would also act as a check on any type of abuse of liberty.
And here you see, I think, a rather helpful Venn diagram, again reminding you how these levels of government sort of interact, or where you may see some overlap, as well as their unique and distinct powers. And this is something we had already covered in the Constitution PowerPoint, and it is there for you to review, if you need some further reminder.
Well, and remember, like national powers, those would be what we had called enumerated powers or express powers. The shared powers, we also use the term concurrent powers. And the state powers, as they're listed on this diagram, we called those reserved powers. This diagram doesn't include some other things like denied powers or implied powers, but those are also important to understand. I think these questions we're going to probably discuss in class, but these are something you can go ahead and look at and think about, kind of how you would answer these questions. But I think this will be something we can discuss together.
So at this point, we're going to look into, or look further, delve into the sort of different types of federalism. Again, as we've mentioned before, there's an evolution in the sort of relationship between the central government and the state government. And it's going to be helpful to use the words that describe the federal type of federalism here to help you remember. We're going to come up with some mnemonic devices and ways in which you can play with these words to help you remember the concepts or major themes that really characterize each type of federalism. In this case, you have two diagrams that sort of help, again, to physically represent through pictures what's going on in these different types of federalism. And I think it's always helpful to have visuals when we're trying to understand abstract concepts. In the case of dual federalism, I want you to think, at the very beginning of our country's founding, if you recall, the very first form of government we had was a confederation. And we talked about the reasons for why the founding fathers may have, or if you will, the people of the colonies may have opted for a confederation. Again, they had just fought a revolutionary war against what they believed to be an autocratic, a sort of central authority that was not responsive to them. So they were very leery of any form of government where there's too much power concentrated in a central authority that seemed to be detached or removed from their locality or region. They realized, obviously, over time that that was a flawed arrangement and wasn't functional. If you recall the precipitating moment, Shays' Rebellion, that sort of really brought that into sharp relief. So what you see here with dual federalism is, if you will, getting the feet wet. and the states are sort of navigating for the first time this new arrangement where they have ceded some of their powers over to the federal government. And it's important to note that both of these circles are roughly equal in size because both the federal and state governments shared roughly equal powers in terms of the way in which they interrelated or areas in which they sort of exercise sole domain. But the states really sort of, if you will, maintained their some very important powers, and the federal government sort of stayed in its lane as well. To some extent, there was a respecting of each other's lanes, and you didn't see much intermixing.
Right, you kind of see, I think of it as like two parallel lines almost, where the federal government handled big issues, the national issues like issues of war or making treaties and things like that are traditional federal powers, while the states handled, their local affairs with very little federal interference. Typically, if you talk about public schools as those came about, or, handling who could vote, like we talked about how states could originally determine who could vote without any federal interference. But over time, you start to see this change, the relationship somewhat change, and so we come up with sort of a new definition, cooperative federalism.
And I think it's important to note, as we segue into cooperative federalism, that we can play around with this term dual federalism. It will sort of set us up into what will be happening with cooperative federalism. See, as time went on, the, if you will, business and localities, as we started to see people expand beyond just their local communities, and we saw more relationships form cross state boundaries. If you remember, one of the powers the federal government has is the power to regulate interstate commerce. And as we see business grow, we see the possible purview of the federal government grow as well. But this is going to present some controversy and conflict between both the federal and state government. And so I sometimes like to remind students that we can look at that word dual, D-U-A-L, and play around with it and instead think of it as dual, D-U-E-L. In a way, you can think of the federal and state government as two equally matched opponents, and there's going to be a level of antagonism between them as time grows on, because they're going to be sorting out the boundaries of their powers. And we're going to find that the federal government, it will take some time, but is going to start to stretch its powers, especially via the Commerce Clause. If you remember, the Commerce Clause was one of the major clauses we looked at in the Constitution PowerPoint. So as business grows and as business became more interstate and other issues became more national in nature, so too was the potential power of the federal government. And I say potential because the federal government isn't able to seize on that power immediately. It's going to have to go through some aches and pains with their fellow states. And so sometimes it's helpful to think of dual federalism also as D-U-E-L, because the federal and state governments are going to have some level of antagonism existing between them as they sort out their powers vis-a-vis one another.
Okay. And cooperative federalism also can be, a bit misleading in some cases, because that tension continues, with cooperative federalism. I think the major shift is now you start to have the national government wanting to achieve certain national goals, and oftentimes what they entice the states with is the promise of federal money. And you do start to see more cooperation in terms of achieving goals, particularly when we get to the Great Depression and with the onset of the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. You start to see the national government coming up with ways to bring us out of the economic crisis of the Great Depression, and they often provide funding and work together with the states to bring jobs to people, or to creating new programs that are carried out at the state level, but often with federal guidance and federal funding. So in that sense, you start to see cooperation, and we see that on through the rest of our history up to the modern times. We'll talk about some shifts in that, but But where the federal government, often provides funding for programs, take, for example, also, Medicaid, the Medicaid healthcare program, or, welfare funding, where the federal government provides funding, but the states actually carry out and distribute the benefits to the people within their state. But on the other hand, cooperative federalism, we see the continuation of tension, especially as the federal government tries to increase its directives or its power over the states. You start to see the states push back, and we'll finally get to the more recent trend of so-called new federalism.
So just to remind you once again about dual federalism, another interesting thing to, if you will, explore during this time period, and let me say that roughly these eras of or types of federalism sort of track certain ranges of years. So dual federalism, you sort of want to think of as the very sort of beginning, like 1787, when the Constitution's formed, up through perhaps the turn of the century. We start to see cooperative federalism come into play as we make that turn into the new century, but is especially pronounced when we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt's election in 1932. And from there on till about 1970s, we have a very strong federal government, and we start to see some new type of federalism emerge thereafter, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But notice with dual federalism that the Constitution is going to be interpreted very narrowly. Now, think practically why that makes sense. The Constitution, after all, is a what type of document? A federal document, right? And it enumerates the federal powers. So if you're going to constrain the scope of the power of the federal government, you'd want to make sure that your interpretation of those powers in the Constitution is very narrow instead of being expansive. So you're going to see that the federal government's limited to only the powers explicitly listed in, or written, if you will, in the Constitution.
So again, you see that to a large degree, like I mentioned before, the national government kind of handled certain powers and certain responsibilities, and the states handled their local and state affairs. For instance, whereas today we see the federal government, for instance, saying that marriage equality includes, the marriage between same-sex couples. In the 1800s, when dual federalism was prevalent, the national government had absolutely nothing to say about how states, wrote their marriage laws, for example. The national government handled their affairs and the states handled their affairs, and very little was sort of shared between the two levels. Sometimes we also, we call this layer cake federalism, using that visual. If you think about the different layers of a cake separated by different layers of icing, of course, in this cake, it has 3 layers, but you could also, I guess, throw in local government. In some cases, local or city governments also kind of handled their own affairs as they do today. But you see that separation, the separation between national government and state government, where they each kind of stayed within, as Mr. Davos said, within their own lanes.
So here are some interesting historical examples to give you some historical context of what this meant. What does dual federalism look like, right, in real time, or rather in terms of real examples? And one great example of dual federalism, if you will, was this policy of laissez-faire, or hands-off. And typically what happened was that even as businesses were expanding and were in fact becoming more interstate or national types of businesses, we saw reluctance, or perhaps the states were the businesses were powerful enough to fend off the federal government from really overseeing their affairs. In other words, the federal government could have asserted themselves more, but chose not to during this period of time. The Gilded Age, it's an interesting term indeed, and you'll learn more about this in U.S. history, but this was a period of time from the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. And it was also a period of time, incidentally, of a lot of corruption, of a lot of graft, And what we saw was that there was a lot of manipulation going on in terms of people paying each other off. So perhaps part of the reason why the federal government wasn't as assertive here was because there was some sort of collusion going on between those who were responsible for overseeing these businesses and the businesses themselves. The Dred Scott decision is another good example of this, where the Supreme Court decides that states can decide their own laws about slavery in terms of deciding, how to look into, or rather to. You want to chime in on this one? I'm getting tongue-tied.
Whether or not they were going to allow for slavery
Right.
to expand into their territory.
Yes.
And, the Jim Crow laws, I think, are a good example as well, because, when we talk about, as Mr. Davos said, it's a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. I think this is a good example because at this point, you had already seen the 14th Amendment added to the Constitution, which said all people essentially have equal treatment under the law. But yet, what does that mean? What does equality mean? And so in Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy challenged a law, Jim Crow laws, which was segregation in Louisiana, when they had separate train cars for African-American passengers versus white. And when he challenged the fact that he was not allowed to travel on the train car reserved for whites, the court found that it was actually okay for Louisiana to separate people by race, because they said, well, okay, you're separating them, but technically it's equal, by having, if you had, let's say, equal accommodations in the different train cars, which often wasn't the case, but that's a narrow reading of the notion of equality, right? The equality, you would say, by taking races and separating them, is that not sort of inherently unequal? But in this case, they're saying it's okay. So that's a very narrow reading of the idea of equality.
We should add perhaps a reading that's not a sort of, if you will, natural conclusion just based on the language itself. And we're going to see that sometimes the Supreme Court, depending on what's going on in the rest of the country, is going to be forced to come to decisions that may really not follow naturally from the language that's actually contained in the Constitution. And so in this case, it's a very tortured kind of reasoning that we'll see in a later case. The Supreme, a later Supreme Court is going to decide that this is this kind of interpretation was really flawed and not what was intended at all. I think any plain reading of the Constitution made quite clear, considering the fact that this amendment was passed due in part over the issue of slavery. It was meant to, in fact, enfranchise former slaves in the whole sort of process. This was clearly a decision that was controversial and would later face some challenge. So we see, as we had already mentioned, that there's a switch from dual to cooperative federalism. And then that cooperative federalism becomes quite the sort of, name of the game from 1932 to, I would say, the late 1970s. It's true that we'll still see a much stronger role for the federal government throughout the 20th century, but something's going to change here in the late 1970s and segueing into 1980. There's one other thing I want to mention before we leave cooperative federalism here. You'll notice the diagram in the upper right-hand corner. It's important to understand that while there was a cooperative relationship, as Mr. Phillips mentioned before, where they each took on certain roles to tackle big issues, it's also worth noting that notice that the federal government is positioned above the state government. That's also by design and on purpose. Why? Well, I like to play with this word cooperative, and I'd like to change it into the word co-opt. And if you look up the word co-opt, it's to sort of borrow something and make it your own. And in this case, the federal government was successful in many ways in terms of incentivizing or perhaps appealing to the states and sort of enticing the states rather to cede some of their authority on issues in exchange for money and grants, to be specific, as well as the use of mandates, which we're going to talk about here momentarily as well. And so in some ways, the federal government was successfully co-opting some of the powers that had traditionally been reserved for the state government.
Okay, so you see here again, the federal government starts to really build off of the idea of this, that the supremacy clause that we talked about in Article 6. It was always there, but during the 1800s and early 1900s, the federal government didn't press quite as hard to exert their powers over the states, with certain exceptions. But now we start to see a more broad interpretation of the Constitution. We start to see Congress and the federal government seek to expand their power and dictate more to the states what they want to accomplish. And the states, in some cases, are dragged along kicking and screaming because although the states are willing to take that federal money, they often don't like the fact that the federal government seems to be interfering more in what were traditionally state affairs. So you start to see also an expansion of the necessary proper clause or the elastic clause as Congress justifies expanding its power, especially in areas like Mr. Dabo mentioned with interstate commerce. We see it in particular, but we'll look at some other examples as well. Okay, this is another diagram to help you understand, with cooperative federalism, we said with dual federalism, you think about the layer cake and the two levels pretty much, stayed separate with certain exceptions. But with marble cake, you see much more of an intermixing. If you said, the vanilla and the chocolate, for example, if one was the federal government, one was the state government, that their powers are much more now interwoven. You see much more of a shared responsibility and shared action when it comes to carrying out their powers.
So here we have some examples of cooperative federalism. As Mr. Phillips already mentioned, one of the best examples of cooperative federalism was the New Deal. In this case, what happened was that business sort of ran rampant and awry in terms of their practices, leading to the stock market crash in 1929 rather. And this really sort of soured people's impressions of the ability of business to control themselves. And at that point, there was a clamoring for some entity, in this case, it will be the federal government, to, if you will, right the ship and correct the wrongs that the free market was unable to prevent. And so really the only entity in society powerful enough to take on the big businesses and sort of get everything back in order, at least the people believe, was the federal government. I think it's important when we talk about this that the reason why the federal government becomes so dominant during this era was that there was a real push for an entity to insert itself to remedy the wrongs that the free market or business sort of wreaked on the society at that time. And so this was not some sort of unilateral power grab by the federal government. This was actually something that the people had voted in terms of policies and positions. FDR, after all, was voted to 4 terms. And notice, too, the Great Society with Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1960s continues this tradition where the federal government is going to insert itself in an attempt to make life better for especially those groups of people who were marginalized or downtrodden, who may not have been as powerful in society. In other words, the federal government is going to become an agent of change. Now, we're going to find later on when we talk about political ideologies that this is going to define certain political groups and political ideologies for some time to come. It's worth noting it now, however. Ultimately, the Great Society was a program that meant to end discrimination and to provide, if you will, services, welfare services, especially housing and the like, to those people who were poor, especially communities of color who had largely been, relegated, or who had largely been discriminated against for some time. And notice is finally here, the final example rather, the No Child Left Behind Act and the Race to the Top, which was an Obama-era policy. In both of these instances, we see the federal government inserting itself in the area of education. If you recall, education is one of those powers that's typically reserved for the states, right? In both of these cases, what the federal government does, it essentially proposes a deal the states are not able to refuse, right? Sort of like a Godfather reference. But nonetheless, the point of the matter here is the federal government says, hey, states, you want our money for education? Well, if you do, you need to complete the requirements or criteria we've set out here in these particular pieces of legislation. Now, it doesn't have to always look punitive. In the case of Race to the Top, for example, these were funds that were to incentivize innovation. The states were supposed to submit proposals and ideas as to how to innovate and improve education. And this grant process, they would evaluate your application and then hand out money accordingly to incentivize states to really get in the business of reviewing and bettering their educational programs.
Okay, so this is just showing you, again, a few examples of the expansion of federal power by using grants. And grants is going to be, using grants and aid or federal grants of money is how the national government often gets the states to buy into the goals that the national government's trying to achieve. For instance, the land grant you see, the Morrill Land Grant of 1862, they offer up federal land to the states if they use the money from the sale of those lands to establish universities. So the national government's goal being to promote higher education for more Americans, and the states then would be incentivized to follow that or to use that money, because they're offered from the federal government. So the national, you see, like UGA, Georgia was a land grant college, as they call it, because that money came from this program. This diagram is not the best here. It's not a great
I don't
picture.
like this
It's
diagram.
very hard to read, but I think in this sense it's another way of looking at the cooperative federalism, picket fence federalism, saying that like within each area of government, we can't even see some of these, but I guess agriculture and higher education, it's actually, you have the national, state, and actually local governments working together to, for instance, build roads or promote college education, things like that. So it's not a major theme that we need to deal with, but just another way of looking at it.
So now we are going to introduce you to a new type of federalism, if you will, right? Pun intended. So if you recall, we have discussed up to this point dual federalism. Remember, during the sort of era, the first of our founding, if you will, 1787, let's say, up to the turn of the century, so the early 1900s. Then we get cooperative federalism from around the 1930s to then about the late 1970s. And now, as we transition into the 1980s, the late 1970s and late 1980s, we see a push, especially among conservatives, of a sort of they want to revert powers that had traditionally then been consolidated in the federal government's hands back to the states. In other words, they're getting increasingly concerned that the federal government has become too powerful, has taken on too many responsibilities, and has relegated states to almost obscurity or rather irrelevance. And they're concerned about this, and we start to see what is going to be termed to some extent when Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, the Reagan Revolution, the Devolution Revolution. And let's look at that word devolution here. And you'll notice that devolution essentially speaks to the attempt to limit the powers of the federal government, but we're devolving power. That means we're, if you will, sending power back down to the states is the idea. And so you'll notice the word decentralization as well. So when power was concentrating in the central government or federal government's hands, we would call that centralization of power. In this case now we see a clamoring for or a call for on behalf of also the public, and politicians are responding, of sending power back to the states. And this included efforts to reduce the national control over grants, and in terms of grants and aid programs. And we start to see a revision of the character of the federal involvement in general welfare spending. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Welfare Reform Act of '96.
I think also, this is a philosophical attempt to shift power back to the states and balance the two levels again, but it also has practical reasons behind it, because the federal government simply was starting to build up more debt and looking for ways under Nixon and especially Reagan, wanting to reduce some of the federal responsibility, especially when it comes to social programs, social spending, not so much military spending, but with social spending, they want an effort to kind of shift more of that responsibility back to the states, which they presumed would save the federal government some money.
So if you recall, when we were talking about cooperative federalism, we said that the federal government had various tools at their disposal to try and incentivize and entice states to do what they wanted them to do. And in this case, I sort of would like for you to think of an analogy here, and you can think of the states as, for example, as animals, and the federal government is sort of the animal trainer. And if you think of it that way, you understand that animal trainers have one of two ways to get the animals to perform the tricks that they want them to. And you'll figure out why I'm going with this analogy here in just a moment. One of two ways, right? One way that the animal trainer can get the animal to do the trick is by presenting negative stimuli. In other words, perhaps hitting the animal with the stick or with a whip of some sort, and that the animal will perform the trick because it wants to avoid the punishment. And in this case, the federal mandate sort of works that way too, where the federal government requires the states to comply with rules and regulations, as well as requires them to cover the costs of implementing those programs. And that's why we say that mandates typically tend to be unfunded. Some of the most notable unfunded mandates are the Endangered Species Act and the American with Disabilities Act. And in this case, the states have no choice but to follow, indeed, the mandate, or if you will, the declaration or the rules and regulations, if you will, of the federal government, whether or not the federal government has decided to give them money to accommodate or absorb those costs.
Right. So think about how the federal government, under the Supremacy Clause, the federal government is supreme, which we talked about means not only is the U.S. Constitution supreme over all law, but the federal laws trump state laws. Federal laws take precedence or preempt state laws. So when the federal government puts a mandate in place, puts a regulation in place, the states must also comply with that regulation. For example, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, part of the mandate from the government, or that law, was that all government buildings had to be accessible to people with disabilities. So think about the fact that state government buildings would have to be often retrofitted to accommodate people with wheelchairs. So that, for instance, imagine the cost of having to construct a ramp now at all these buildings that had previously probably just had maybe stairs to enter. And although I think we'd all agree, that's a good thing, that people should have access to these buildings, from the state's perspective, they might be okay with it, but they'd say, hey, why don't you guys give us some money to help us pay for this. So they kind of resented the fact that, one, the federal government is telling them what they have to do, but even more so, they're doing it without the accompanying money, and so the states have to pick up that funding or find the funding somewhere.
I want to add here that while mandates get maybe a bad rap or seem like they are, imposing these draconian rules, it's worth noting the areas in which these mandates sort of address. Notice the Federal Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act and clean water as well. A lot of these are common goods. In other words, it's really difficult, if you will, to make sure that we have clean air if we did it on a state-by-state basis. For example, you could imagine that a state like West Virginia, which has a huge coal industry, they're probably not going to be as inclined to participate in a clear air policy kind of push. So that presents a problem because let's imagine that a bordering state does. Well, we understand that air doesn't just stay in one area. It travels from state to state, and it's going to have health impacts for all states as well. There are costs associated with these states not complying. So to some extent, the federal government saw itself as the only remedy in these efforts to try and make sure to provide a good or protect certain, or frankly, the American people, in this case, from something that was clearly creating problems.
This is, I think, not a major issue that we need to deal with, but the Congress did try to address this under Newt Gingrich and the Republicans when they took over. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, though, didn't go very far in stopping unfunded mandates. All it did basically was the government has to at least, say the government has to at least consider the impact of different laws they pass before they pass them. But essentially, they could still, pass on these mandates to the states and not necessarily provide funding. It could be unfunded. There's also the term underfunded mandates, where the federal government promises money, but they often don't provide actually enough, as far as the states see it, that not enough to carry out those programs.
So here's the other tool, if you will, available to the federal government. If you recall the analogy, let's continue with the analogy of the animal trainer and the animals, if you will. If the federal government, again, is the animal trainer and the states are the animals, remember I told you that there's one of two ways. We already covered the way in which the animal trainer can get the animal to do the tricks via negative stimuli, but there's also a way to do it through positive stimuli or stimulus, and that is, well, provide a treat or reward. In this case, the treat and the reward, as we would, in political circles, political science circles, we typically will refer to grants as a carrot, if you will, an incentive or an enticement to get a state to do what the federal government would otherwise want them to do. And so in this case, if you will, with the analogy, the animal performs the trick because it wants the reward or treat. And something very much like that is taking place when the federal government attaches certain contingencies, or if you will, criteria to money it hands out to states. And on that topic, there's one of two types of grants that the federal government can offer. Well, the two types of grants the federal government can offer are block grants or categorical grants. Now, you can see from the definitions here that the block grants are grants that are provided to the states from the federal government with fewer strings attached. Now, at this moment, I really want to emphasize something, and I'm sure Mr. Phillips runs into the same issue. Please don't reinterpret fewer strings attached as no strings attached. Students often make the mistake, and for whatever reason, want to draw a complete absolute contrast between block grants and categorical grants. And that would be a mistake, because oftentimes on tests or quizzes, we're going to make sure that you're paying close attention to the words we're using. And so precision of language is really important here. Notice again, block grants have fewer strings attached, right? So that there are still some limitations. Well, what does that look like? Well, for example, if the federal government was giving grants to a state or states rather for transportation, they may just designate a certain general category like transportation. To contrast that though with categorical grants, that grant would say not just transportation, but that you would specifically have to use it for on-ramps and off-ramps in these particular interstate areas. In other words, they would attach a lot more criteria, limitations, rules, and regulations to it. But typically with a block grant, it sort of designates a certain area in which the money should be used, right? And so in this case, states can decide which roads can be built, where they will be located. That's to be contrasted with categorical grants. And in this case, you can see the grants under, a categorical grant will have many strings attached to it. So following along with the example, a grant for roads, but the federal government decides where roads will go and which roads can be widened. I want to give you a mnemonic device here, right? If you think about a block, it's general, right? Or a blockhead, there's not much substance inside it, right? They won't have a lot of detailed knowledge. Well, in a similar way, a block grant is very generic, very general and broad. Whereas a categorical grant, as you'll notice the root word here, categories, has a lot of categories, right? Has a lot of limits. So let the words do some of that work for you. The mnemonic devices are very helpful to help trigger your memory so you can remember a lot of information without having to really struggle through it, right? Those triggers are very helpful.
But again, yeah, I mean, in a block grant, there's still going to be federal guidelines on how to spend that money. The key is the states are given more flexibility than they are under categorical grants, but the block grant is still going to be designated for a specific program, such as roads or such as education or such as welfare funding, for example. But they're going to allow states to have more flexibility. For example, you can decide to some degree who qualifies for welfare, but you still have to follow the general guidelines that have been set by the federal government. In a categorical grant, states simply aren't given as much flexibility, so states would much prefer a block grant, but in both cases, the federal government is trying to achieve a certain goal, so they're going to set certain parameters and certain regulations. So the Welfare Act of 1996 is sometimes pointed to as an example of a block grant. The truth is, I think most grants are probably, it's hard to classify. There's maybe somewhere in between, a block grant and a categorical grant. But this one was typically seen as being a block grant because the state was given some flexibility on how to interpret the law and how to spend the welfare money that was granted. So they block grant the money, they give the states a certain amount of funding, and then the states will distribute that funding within their state, following the general guidelines, but with some flexibility. For example, if you said, well, you have to actually be seeking work to receive welfare funding, some states might interpret that as you're getting training to help you learn a skill that will help you get a job. They would include that as seeking work because you're actually maybe taking a class or going to a training program, and that they could include that as seeking employment, whereas another state may not include that under the category of seeking employment, and so they might not provide the funding in that state. So states are given some flexibility within the guidelines.